Hi everybody, I'm ever so glad you're here. Thanks so much for logging on when it's very late in the evening for me. I don't suppose it's so late for you. So I'm going to talk to you about the report that we did for the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh about pre-hospital care, for the Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care, which we call Valuing Staff, Valuing Patients. And it was a report on psychosocial care and the mental health programmes, the ways that we're trying to support people in PHEM. And big part of the reason for doing it was to look at what's happening for trainees, because it's just a particularly difficult type of training. So I will talk a bit about trainees in the talk, but I'm also going to talk about leadership and management. So any of you who are on the call who've got leadership roles, and remember that having a leadership role doesn't just mean having that in your job title of being the boss, but also because we can kind of lead like sideways and we can manage up, can't we? So there's a lot of leadership we might be doing without having that management role or leadership role in our job description or our title. So it's something to think about the ways you can lead by example. Sometimes it's your years of seniority which make you a more influential person for people coming in. So we'll talk a bit about that. We're going to talk about responding to distress, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to go over these 15 golden approaches that are highlighted in the report, but I want to talk very kind of practically about how you can implement them. So that's really why I'd love to invite your questions in the chat, because above all, I want to be useful, because you can read the report. You don't need me to read the report to you. You can read it, but I want to be useful to you about how do you actually implement some of the guidance in there. All right. So one of the things that we want to think about is, so a lot of our mental health and well-being is social. Okay, so however much of a loner you might be or an introvert you might be yourself, humans are built to function in groups. And that's because in order to survive, like in evolutionary terms, in order to survive, we needed to be in groups. We can't actually do it on our own. And we know that loneliness and isolation is very, very bad for people. It's bad for your physical and mental health. My students have all learned to parrot it back at me now, and they all go, oh yes, it's as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which it is, has a really bad effect on your health. So when we talk about well-being, we think about individuals very often, but actually we need to think about groups of people and the ways in which our ability to participate in groups at work affects our well-being. So I think in healthcare, but especially in pre-hospital care and in paramedicine, so paramedics will always talk about their green family, and the idea of connectedness at work is really, really protective for your mental health. So one of the things that works really well for teams is time to be together. That's not necessarily going out socializing together. I don't mean that so much, although that's lovely, but being able to sit down and have a cup of tea together at work, or just have 5 minutes, doesn't have to be very long, just 5 minutes where everybody just pushes back for just a few minutes to just shoot the breeze. It can be talking about absolutely anything at all. So the sort of talk that supports our well-being doesn't have to be about difficult things. It can be about really ordinary things as well, because we want to feel good as well, so it's really nice to be able to share our good news. But also one of the things that teams need to ensure their wellness at work, if you imagine your team as a whole, is to do good work together, so to be really effective together. And so in PHEM, a lot of the training is done as a team, because you're going to work as a team, usually in really high pressure situations. So the fact that you do good work together is another thing. I don't know, it's so important to understand how much that protects you, more than you would think. So often when we think about psychological well-being and looking after people at work, we think we've got to do something on top. And there are extra things we can do, but the work in itself is beneficial for you. And that's largely because when people choose to go into careers like this, I don't know if this is news to you, but they're not going into it for the money. Okay, so most people are going into work like this because it aligns with their values and who they are inside themselves and who they want to be in the world, and the help that they want to give to the world, right? So doing the work well is really protective for teams. we need our personal efficacy, so we've got to be good at what we do so that our team can be good at what it does, but we also need agency. So one of the ABCs of doing well at work or being well at work is autonomy. So teams and individuals need to be able to say what they need. So if you're lacking in training, if you don't have some kit, if you're, I don't know, being sent inappropriately to certain kinds of jobs, teams need to be able to raise concerns. And the final thing, and I'm going to mention this more than once, so expect to hear a lot about it, is peer support. So you will have heard a lot about it, I'm sure, already. And I think it's worth talking about why peer support is so important and why it works so well. So parts of the reasons why it works so well is because there's nothing like a shared experience. So when you do a similar job to someone, you have a kind of shorthand with each other. So you don't always need to go into the details of a particular incident or use a lot of words, even particularly to share an experience with someone. Because one of the most fatiguing things sometimes when we're not doing great or when we are overwhelmed is to have to keep telling the story. And it can be quite re-traumatizing, to be fair. So peer support works because you have a shorthand. Peer support also works because in the kinds of work that you do, one of the things that we found in the research is that practitioners, people don't always feel comfortable telling these kinds of stories to family members, and certainly not to friends often, because they're often really upsetting. So they don't want to share like the gory details. There isn't that desire to tell people that. And then that can be explained in psychological terms, that can be explained in all sorts of different ways. But when you use peer support, you don't have to worry about that as much because people have already seen what there is to see. So you can't hurt them. You know, you're not going to shock them or frighten them or change their view of the world in any way, because they've already had that experience. They've already had it happen. The other thing about peer support is that sometimes you're being supported and sometimes you're the supporter. So a really important thing for our self-esteem and well-being is to feel like we're on top of things and we're all right. That's why we say we're all right when we're not all right. So if you've got a kind of balance of you offering help and you receiving help, that's a really nice way for you to stay on a bit more of an even keel. So you're not always the one that needs the help. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why peer support works. So I think it's had insufficient prowess, if you like. I think sometimes there's a tendency to think you've got to bring experts in to help teams, and experts are great. I'm quite expert in some things, but I don't know the job like you know the job, you know. So while I might be able to come and give a talk or hang out or work something out with you, there's always a place for peer support, and it can always be the first thing that gets done. So thinking about trainees, so some of you on the call might be trainees and some of you were trainees. So one of the hardest things for trainees in PHEM is the clinical work itself, because the types of, when you're working pre-hospitally and in emergency medicine more broadly, the types of scenes that you're exposed to, there's often violence or terrible injuries, or maybe children are injured. There's a high level of expressed emotion. There's lots of people there who are really upset, and you're trying to kind of keep your calm because you need to do the work. So that's a lot. If you think about that emotional labor, there's a lot to do. So there's a lot of, your brain is really working hard to filter out the stuff that you don't want to focus on, because just now you need to focus on doing the medicine, and you need to remember to communicate with all your team, people that you need to communicate with, and probably other services as well. All right, so it's a lot. Like intellectually there's a lot going on, and emotionally there's a lot of work going on. So that's why we talk about running out of bandwidth. You know, there's only finite capacity of what we can manage. And when you're a trainee, you'll be doing lots of things for the first time, which is always hard, isn't it? And you don't have, you know, once you start to get some of those nice experiences under your belt where you've been competent and it's gone all right and you've done okay, that's much more reassuring. So, but early on in your journey, you haven't got that reassurance that we build up with experience. So it's a very demanding clinical workload. There's a lot to learn, a lot to study, and a lot to remember. And some of the scenes that you're exposed to when you work in medicine at all, but especially pre-hospitally, will resonate with your life. So that happens at any point in your career. But for trainees, these things are happening perhaps for the first time. And sometimes it's what you're afraid of. You know, you see something happen and that's the thing that you're afraid of. And I've talked to, well, these were not trainees as consultants, but still, we were sitting around talking one day about this kind of thing. And they talked about how much this work changed for them when they became parents. So our big life transitions, so whether that's trainee to not trainee, whether that's getting married, whether it's one of your parents becoming ill or anything like that. So the big life transitions, they do really affect the way work affects us. Of course, when you're training, you're more likely to make mistakes. And when you're training, it's more devastating when you make a mistake. So the mistakes are much higher stakes, if you like, for the trainees. So that can be very, very difficult. And then the type of clinical governance meetings, D&Ds, whatever, that you might hold in pre-hospital medicine might be different to the ways in which cases are discussed in other areas of medicine. And that can be quite challenging at the beginning. So that's something to remember if you are a sort of veteran of doing these, to try to remember what it was like to first sit in one and have your work scrutinised so carefully and so minutely. That's quite a lot of exposure. You know, you're already new at it, you're already training, you've got exams to take. You've got to prove yourself, you've got to get things signed off, and you've got to sit through these meetings where we will talk about the work that's gone on. I'm just going to talk briefly about primary and secondary stressors because they come up in the report a lot, and even I struggle to keep it straight in my mind. So the primary stressor is the source of worry or anxiety that stems from the event, right? So that might be one event. So that might be attendance at one particular scene or one particular job, or it might be being involved in some, it could be something that happens to you as well as just a job that you go to. So when we found in the Manchester bombing that the bombing itself is the primary stressor, but then there are lots of other stressors around it, okay? So it might be a job that you go to, but it might be a series of jobs that you've gone to. So it might be a particular thing that upsets you or stays with you. So moral distress and moral injury, which is where I do my research, are results of the primary stressor. So they're results of the incident itself. But the secondary stressors are more like the social factors that come around it, like your life circumstances. So we all know, don't we, that we can be okay at work, even in the most difficult circumstances, if everything else is all right. But very often in life, everything else isn't all right. Perhaps there are relationship problems or problems with your children or problems with pets or family members, all sorts of things, worrying about accommodation or rent or all kinds of stuff. Money, of course, huge worry for lots of people now. So that's a secondary stressor and is going on in the background. Sometimes it's societal stuff, like horrible things in the media or the sorts of stuff that gets said on the news about whether people are going on strike or not, or ambulance waiting times, whatever it might be. So that's actually a massive secondary stressor. And I hope that you know, like you're aware of the impact of that, because it is something to buffer against because it's such a difficult thing. And then organizational responses. So if your organization doesn't stand up for you, if your organization doesn't thank you for your good work, or at least try to have enough staff or try to mitigate some of the difficult situations, these are secondary stressors. And they tend to kind of grind away in the background, making life difficult. If you haven't got the resources or the training to do your job, so you're expected to act beyond your competence. So in the pandemic, a good example is where certainly in the hospitals, people were being deployed to ITU. That wasn't their usual job at all. So their primary stressor might have been their experience in ITU, right? So that was really difficult. But the other thing that they were wrestling with is the fact that they're very highly trained in some other area. So going to ITU and not doing highly trained work was a big struggle for them. And they often experienced a lot of kind of like guilt, really, more than anything, feeling that they should have done more, whereas actually they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, but it didn't sit well with them at all because they weren't acting at their correct level of competence. So some of the secondary stressors for trainees can be trying to manage their caring responsibilities and parental leave around trying to get their training done and all their sign-offs, and study for exams and manage shift work. So the other thing is that often trainees in PHEM have to travel, so they're not living at home, or they're doing a couple of shifts, going a long way to do a couple of shifts and then coming back again. It's very, very challenging training program indeed from a logistical perspective. So there's a lot of isolation, might be moving around, you see, which makes isolation work. And of course, fatigue and the dreaded exams. It's an awful lot of pressure to perform on lots of different levels while finding superhuman amounts of energy. So those are the things that came up in the report that trainees really struggle with, and which the faculty is trying to better support them with, because I mean, that's the important thing, is that we say these things out loud so that we can try and help people. So more generally at work, in terms of support and intervention, I'm just going to see if I can move this. There we go. There's a lot we can do for people that probably feels like we're not doing very much, but actually we are. If that makes sense. I will make that make sense for you. So everybody needs a person or a place to go to when they need immediate support or time for reflection. So in every workplace, or whether that's even out on the road or on scene, people need a little place to go and just breathe for a minute. And it's very useful to have something like a buddy system at work, similar to, maybe you don't have to call it that, but similar to that at work, so that somebody knows that they've always got somebody to just let off steam with for just a minute in that moment, in the immediate, when things are difficult. It's really important to link wellbeing, psychosocial and mental health aspects of workforce to the clinical and governance roles, right? So when people are in charge of safety and they're in charge of governance, they should also be in charge of wellbeing, psychosocial care. Because if we embed this stuff in the culture of the workplace, then we give it value for our employees. We give it value for all the employees, right? But we also give it value for management, which is what we're trying to do, because we want them to know how important we think this is. And when we send that message to management and to our employees, we already are doing the work of helping people feel better at work. So it's really important to intervene early when people are distressed. And the kind of intervention that most people need is someone to listen, some place where it's all right to go and talk at work. And it's one of those things, isn't it, that's easy to say and hard to do. And we're going to get on to in a minute how we can make it easier for people to talk things through at work. If it's the culture of the workplace to talk stuff through at work, then people will just do it. If it's not the culture, then it's something that we need to make an effort to create. So we need to allow people to tell the truth. We need to allow people to say when things are really bad, or they're scared, or they feel like they messed up, or they can't stop thinking about something. And I do think it's important to point out at this point is, if you've been trained in a job where you go and fix things, or you go and make things better, like most of medicine, really most of medicine, it's actually quite hard not to do anything. It's quite hard to just listen and just allow people to say how it is for them and provide a space for that. That's quite a difficult thing to do, because a lot of us have this real tendency to want to fix it. Like, we're always thinking of solutions. It's the way we're built, really, I think. So in the report, we talk about a thing called PIES, which is describes the way help should be available, which is it should be nearby. People shouldn't have to go and find it or make an appointment in the future. It should be now. And there should be the expectation of recovery. So the idea is that it's a positive way of approaching this, to say, here is a place where we talk about it when things are difficult. That's a normal, natural thing to do, and we expect people to do it, and all will be well. And to use the simple interventions first, because despite the headlines that you see and sometimes sensational reports that come out, most people are doing all right, even if they're distressed. Like, we can be distressed by our work or upset or angry and still be fundamentally okay. So we're not mentally ill. Okay, so there's a real difference, and I think it's really important to say that some people in the course of their working lives, as a result of the work that they're doing, may develop problems with their mental health that mean that they need a bit of time off and some really specific types of treatment. Most people won't. And even when we're struggling, so even when we are in distress and things are really difficult, most of this can be managed, and it isn't dramatic, it isn't a disaster. What we'd really love to see, if we could really have this, would be more flexible workplaces so that people can take time when they need it and come back without having to be kind of punished for having taken the time. I just say it like it is, sorry, paramedics, you know what I'm talking about, I think. Punished for taking time off. So of course people need the chance to have a back to work interview, that kind of thing, but it shouldn't ever be punitive. It's absolutely human and natural to need a break. And if we'd really thought through designing these roles at work, we would have thought about that. And we would also have thought, although it's out with the scope of this talk, we would also have thought about what we were going to do when people age. I may be the oldest person on this call, I appreciate that, but we do all get older, and we do want to stay in our jobs until we're done with it, rather than until ill health takes us out of them. And so some roles are better suited to when you have fewer years under your belt, and some roles are better suited to when you've got more years under your belt. And the thing is, in medicine, and especially in pre-hospital care, I don't think enough consideration has been given to that. So there aren't good places necessarily for people to move on to when they're starting to age and nights are becoming more difficult, or whatever it might be. So active listening, you've doubtless heard about this. It's the note in the report says learn it and use it. So all active listening is actually paying attention. So it's listening to hear what people have to say rather than listening to try to fix the problem. It's really different from trying to diagnose something. You know, it's really different from that. You just want to know, how is it for that person? So if you do it well and you let yourself relax and just listen, it's actually, no matter how distressing, but even when things are distressing, it's actually quite kind of relaxing, because you're really listening. You're both getting calmer and calmer the more you talk, because you're not trying to think of a solution. You're not trying to think of the next thing to say. You're just hearing this person. And it's enormously validating for people to be heard. This is why listening feels like it's not something, but it really is something. It really, really works. I hope that everybody on the call has had the experience of really being heard by somebody, and they know how much better they felt as a result of it, even though no new solutions were generated at the time. It's worth knowing, now it depends a bit on your role, but it's worth knowing who will or will not need any kind of a medical approach to manage their distress. So are they going to need a referral somewhere else? Have you got to send them to their GP? Do they need some time off? Make sure that you've got an evidence-based approach to that, and that those people who make those kinds of decisions are well informed. And where possible, especially this is for managers and leaders on the call, where possible, seek out these secondary stressors and see if there's anything you can do about them. You might not be able to alleviate some of the struggles people are having at home, but you might be able to support them with some flexible working or a bit of time off while they sort these things out for themselves. If you can see that your team isn't getting sufficient training or isn't getting sufficient breaks, be their advocate. Stand up for them and try and get that changed for them. In a way, almost the outcome doesn't matter. It's the fact that somebody would stand up for us and do something for us to try to make things better. So when people are distressed around us, we all have different responses to it, and some of them depend a bit perhaps on how we are as people, but many of them depend how we're doing in that moment. If we're overwhelmed ourselves, it's enormously difficult to listen to anybody else. Sometimes it's nice to know that you're not the only one, but also you might feel that you can't do anything to make it any better. But we're going to talk about validation. Just acknowledging what has happened to somebody, recognizing it and saying, yes, I see that this has been really upsetting, is called validation. And it helps people know that they've had the experience that they've had, that you have heard them, and then they're not alone in it. So it's funny because the media plays a part in all of this on both sides, because on the one hand, they write ridiculous things and report nonsense a lot of the time, but then sometimes they do say, actually, staff are pushed to their absolute limits, and it can be quite validating to see somebody else tell your truth out loud, if you like. The other thing is that we need our professional acknowledgement. So from our peers and our seniors, we need them to validate our experiences as well. And that's called authoritative validation. And all that means is people who know that what's happening to you is really happening to you. That said, it might be common, but it ain't normal. So one of the things that happens when we say to people that their distress is normal is that we make it small. And it isn't small, it's big and it's scary. The fact that it's happening to lots and lots of people working in pre-hospital care, in pre-hospital medicine, isn't, I mean, it is normal for the work you're doing, if you see what I mean, but we can't discount it. The thing is, you get so used to it because of the job, and it changes the way you perceive it. But when people want to express that they're not okay with it, it's too much, they're not okay in that moment, we need to really let them know that this is a thing that happens to people. It's very common, and we're sorry for it, but it isn't normal. It is usual. I think usual is maybe a better word, one I'm more likely to use. Listening comes up again because it's as good as peer support. Listening does wonderful things for us. But creating a culture where it's safe to speak out and admit fears and mistakes, this is something where we lead by example. So this often comes under advice for leaders, but I would say it isn't just advice for leaders and managers, people with leadership in their job roles, but it's also really good advice for people who've been in the job for that much longer. So if you've been doing it for a while, you can model the really good behaviour to the people who are coming new to the job. So it is safe to speak out. It's safe to admit when you're afraid, or when you think you've done something wrong, or when you did something well. So we lead by example. So this is called modelling. So we want to model the sorts of behaviours we want to see at work. And the more seniority you have, or the more years you've got under your belt in the job, actually the more power you have to be able to do that well and show new people coming along, or younger people coming along, that it's safe to do that. We need to allow staff to access support. So we need to make sure that we know what the support is, that we can signpost to it, but also that it's available. There's no point trying to signpost people to a service that's not going to be able to see them for 6 months or something. And we need to make sure that they've got time in their working week to be able to actually go to appointments, or be on the phone, or be online, however they're going to access the support. We need to make sure that they're able to do that and they've got everything they need to do that. We can't assume that we just recommend it and let them get on with it. I think we need to take a much more active role in it. It may be that someone's able to speak about their distress at work, and so at work we'll recommend that they access support and they do this thing, and that all seems fine, we've had a good conversation. But at home, it's not acceptable for them to say that they need help. Maybe at home there are other things going on, and they need to be strong, and they need to not take time out for themselves to go and talk to someone about how they're feeling or how they're coping with work. We can't predict, and we don't know all the time all the facets of people's lives. We only know the bit we see. So strong support at work, and making time at work wherever we can. So leaders, I always do think when I'm giving talks like this that people in leadership positions, I feel like I'm handing it all up the line to you, and I don't mean to do that at all, because our leaders need as much support as everybody else. So just thinking about psychological safety, which is the degree to which people perceive their work environments as conducive to taking necessary risks while working. So can they, I think it might be interpersonal risks actually, that I've forgotten to put interpersonal in there. So what psychological safety is all about is, can I risk asking a question, trying something new, asking for advice or help, making a suggestion. Is it okay to speak up here? Can I say when I don't think, somebody's suggesting that we absolutely have enough staff or enough training or whatever? Can I disagree? Is it safe? Can I do any of these things? So in an organisation where there isn't good psychological safety, people don't talk. They stop raising issues, and they tend to go quiet. That's why quiet meetings are scary, because that means your workforce isn't all right. And also in leadership and management positions, research suggests that very senior people tend to think that they still have the ear of their workforce and that people will tell them things, whereas actually people won't really tell them things. So it's easy to think that you know what's going on with your workforce when you don't necessarily. So it is something that you really need to pay attention to and find ways to hear the people who are at work. It's not enough to sort of have an open door policy and go, it's fine, come and talk to me about anything, because if that isn't felt to be true in the culture of the workplace, people won't come and talk to you. But things that leaders can do are be very clear in their messaging. So communication really is everything at work. So being very clear about what are the priorities of work, what are we here to do, how do we look after the people who do the work in this organisation? Yeah, so it's not just about that we send you out to do the work, but this is also how we look after you. And ensure that they're effective and supportive, so that they enable people and teams to have a sense of cohesion with one another. So that means, once again, training comes into this, because supporting your teams in having all the resources, whether those are material resources or like intellectual resources from training to do the work, is a really important part of leadership, to let that team form and be strong and solid, so that it supports itself. Yeah, so one of the mistakes I think in leadership can sometimes be to feel like the leader is a sort of lone person at the top, which of course they're not. They need their teams to be strong. They're part of the team, but they kind of dip in and out of it a bit. So you need to have all these strong teams below you working together and training together, and being the advocate and the supporting staff in the face of negative public perceptions and things like all the issues we've been having lately with the waits for ambulance and things. It's been terrible for everyone. It's terrible on both sides. It's terrible for patients. It's absolutely terrible for paramedics and other staff and call handlers and everyone. But a good leader supports their staff and is vocal in their support of their staff to their staff, right? That's part of getting the workplace culture right. So policies that are about supporting staff need to obviously be completely separate from the ones about discipline and performance management. They've got nothing to do with each other. This is what I'm saying about leave, when people need to take time off. From a wellbeing perspective and being able to stay in the job perspective, we need to be very careful about how we bring people back to work when they've taken time out. And remembering also, it's really admirable that somebody's managed to take some time off, because it's actually incredibly hard to do, especially in the health services, because services are overstretched all the time, and actually being able to take a break is a huge deal when you don't want to let your colleagues down. I hear that all the time about people not wanting to let their colleagues down, not to leave the work undone. So supporting staff to take time away and come back does ensure that you have a workforce that can work, but we also have to really be clear about supporting people's good decisions about taking time if time is what they've needed.